RM Sotheby's is the world's largest collector car auction house by total sales. They are the preeminent market maker of high-quality collector cars and collections, regardless of size or complexity. By working in partnership with the Sotheby's team and its network of 80 offices in 40 countries, RM Sotheby's has established the largest client network of any collector car auction house in the world. Join the RM Sotheby's family by connecting with one of their car specialists at rmsotheby's.com or contact me directly at gstanley@rmsotheby's.com. All right, so this is the big Moda Miami special here, and I have a returning guest, Evan. Evan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
So you're one of our car specialists, and you're an expert in pre-war cars, and I just had you on the podcast to talk about the huge Mercedes Streamliner. Before we start with some of the cool cars coming to Miami, give me your thoughts on that car, the final hammer price, I guess. $53 million approximately?
Yep, 53 million. I know once these numbers get into this range, they kind of all like, it's hard to decipher them. I mean, it was a spectacular car. And I think like we talked about, it's an interesting car because it's not a straightforward car. You know, it's not how you use it, what you do with it is complicated. And at the end of the day, that's such rarefied air when you get into those values. You're always sort of, you have a meeting before a sale about, who might buy this or that. But, coming up with a list of people who will write a $53 million check on the spot isn't that easy to come up with. So I think it was nice to see how contested it was, how many people were bidding at the level it was. So I was very happy it was well received, and it's significantly more than the last W186 to sell. I think it shows the appreciation for such a significant thing.
Yeah, I think that really was the interesting part of the conversation is what do you do with it? Because of the originality, like you said, you had hoses and belts from the mid 50s,
Yep.
basically as race condition, you really wouldn't want to drive it. And so I would imagine, like the 250 LM, which went for about 33 mil all in.
Yes, 33.4. Yes.
Yeah, like that one you could drive, right?
That was a running car. Yeah, they've driven that car quite a bit, and it's not in that one is a very original car, but it's not in that time capsule. Never touched again after the 54 season, 55 era, and that was what's so unusual about that car. Even among museum cars, they're typically the other cars they have that are well preserved have been used quite a bit over the years.
Yeah, so it's a fun conversation. Like, well, if you could drive that Mercedes Streamliner, would it have added, $5 or $10 million because of the usage aspect of it? It's just a fun kind of thing.
I know it could be the opposite too. If it was running, would it have made it less valuable because it would have lost that perfect state of preservation it is? And when we had the conversations about whether to get the car running or not, I'm often in favor of getting cars running, and the other cars in that collection I was completely but with that car I was not in favor of getting it running, because they said you don't know what the next guy bidding on that car wants. I mean, it could be that the value to him is that perfect state of perfection, that preservation. And so I didn't, I leave that to the next guy for what he wants to do with it and how he wants to approach it. It's not something you want to rush into, a car like that. It's too complicated. Not technically, just historically complicated,
Yeah, and it's funny, when I first thought about who I wanted to have on for the Moda Miami special, you did not pop to mind, because I was thinking Porsche, supercars, Miami.
Oh, sure.
But you were so excited about this 1908 Mercedes car that you can drive. You were so excited about it off of the podcast. I'm like, well, I got to have Evan on to talk about this car, because I'm not a pre-war guy. Sure. I can read the description, I understand the importance, but you were like, this is a monumental car. So let's transition into Moda Miami and some more of the cars from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum.
Yep.
And why don't you tell us about this 1908 Mercedes and why it's such a special piece?
The '08 Mercedes is basically the equivalent of the W196 in its period. It was absolutely the state of the art, finest piece of engineering, most ambitious car of its time and extremely successful in the racing it did. If you go back in history and look at Mercedes standing as a car company, from the period of its inception through 1903 and 1904 to this period, they stood in a position that they never would stand in again. I mean, it's always been an incredibly regarded company. They've had moments of, superiority in racing like no other. But where they stood both as in racing and in perception in the market and what was available to customers, I mean, they were just like incredibly highly regarded and priced accordingly. When the lineage of this particular car starts ultimately with the 60 horse Mercedes of 1903. It's an evolution of that car, and that car is what I think represents the largest jump in performance ever offered in a car. What that car had versus what you could buy in 1902 from the best manufacturers, what you could get in 1903 with that Mercedes is just it was just vastly superior to anything that had come before it, in a way that, it's like a car coming out today that would do 350 miles per hour as opposed to 250 miles per hour. It was just, its performance in 1903 was superior to just about everything made 10 years later. So, wow, and this is an era that's moving lightning fast. I would say in the early days of the car, every year is like 10 years. So, this thing, it's the first modern high performance car is what it is. It's a car that did everything right. Before this point, cars tended to have governors. They had, were somewhat automatic in the way the engines worked. They ran at constant speed, a lot of the early cars. But this was the first car that the driver controlled everything and for performance. So he had full control over the throttle, the ignition timing. It was the first car to have a H-pattern transaxle. It's got three sets of brakes. Two of them are water cooled. Everything about that car was for driving performance, and it was the true first modern ultimate driver car. It's we throw around supercar, but that really was a car that was capable of like 90 miles per hour, out of the box as a road car. And the performance of that car, even, it was virtually unrivaled for that next 10 years. People made equivalently high performance cars, but no one ever really bettered the car that much. And even against cars 20 years later, the performance of that car was still very much on par with, I think a Type 37 Grand Prix Bugatti in the Prescott Hill Climb is about the same speed as a 1903 Mercedes 60 horse. And those are from 1925, 26. Yeah. So it's incredible. So Mercedes just held this position that it was sort of unchallenged as like the greatest car at that time. It was just like, you could buy one in the US in 1903, cost $25,000 to buy a 60 horse Mercedes. Holy cow. That's twice as much as a Duesenberg would cost 30 years later. And the Duesenberg was wildly more expensive than anything else. So it was unfathomably expensive. So what the car we're talking about here, the 1908, and this is the 1908 Brookland type Mercedes, which was the Grand Prix and racing Mercedes design of the era. And this one's specifically a Semmering Mercedes. And this car was built exclusively to win the Semmering Hill Climb. So it is heavily based on the Brookland type Grand Prix car of the time, which was a very successful Grand Prix car. But then punched out to an extreme that even the Grand Prix car wasn't. And the thing about the Mercedes cars in this era was, they are developed from that original engine in 1903. They get quite a bit bigger at this point. The Grand Prix cars range between, I think, 13 and 15 liters. But the overall package with the Mercedes was just like the best. They had the best transaxles, the best brakes, the best handling, a very low position on the car, and very modern too, where, we're coming out of an era when the driver sat very high in a car and upright with the mechanic. And these cars, the column is slammed down really low, the steering column. The driver sits way at the back of the thing, basically at the rear axle. So the whole positioning of this car is the center of gravity is really low. And also despite the huge engines in these things, they made the cars rather petite compared to the competition. Like the radiators are small, the hoods are small. They have enveloping bodies that covered the driver and the mechanic, which is very unusual for the time. And I think what it is Mercedes had such a lead they had the engine technology, and they'd been developing that for 4 or 5 years at that point, or 5 or 6 years at the point, that part was well established for them, and they could really focus on the chassis end of it. And so what they ended up with was like this perfect package that was where the competition never had a car that was might have had a car that had equivalent power, but they never had a car that did everything else as well. And some of that technology I mentioned before, it's got 4-speed transaxle, so it's got a midship mounted transmission with the differential, and then the final drive is by dual chains. So the chain drive created very light rear axle, low unsprung weight. You had 2 inboard brakes on the wheels there, but then you had a brake on the differential carrier as well as the input shaft of the transaxle, and both of those were water cooled and adjustable by the mechanic. So you had 3 sets of brakes on this car. You had 2 brake pedals and a hand lever, so you could let the brakes cool, selectively use them. A lot of very sophisticated design. And when you drive one of these things, they're so incredibly refined and well engineered. They just drive like cars so much. I mean, you have to go so much later to find a car that has the equivalent drivability and also performance. So the Grand Prix cars were 13, 15 liters. This car, because it was built for the hill climb, it had none of the restrictions that were applied to Grand Prix cars. And Grand Prix cars in 2008 started to get a displacement restriction. The bore size was limited at around this time to, I think, around 6 inches. So this car has a 7-inch bore and a 7-inch stroke. So it's about 17.5 liters. So for the hill climb, there were no Grand Prix restrictions. So you could just make the ultimate race car with no limits. And that's what they did. So the interesting thing there is, like, you think in 1908 that a company had the resources to build a car with one event in mind, like that is pretty crazy, and this car for 1909, they built a unique engine just for that car for that one race. So not only is the car purpose built just for that race, they built the next year, they built a whole engine just for it. So only Mercedes could do this at the time. And
yeah, it's crazy because I'm not a pre-war guy, like I said, and you're throwing out these liters. I'm like, well, a 5-liter Mustang, that's a big V8, in today's world.
Right.
Back in the 60s it wasn't, but you're talking about 17.3 liters. I mean, that's got to be like
and that's 4-cylinder,
right? And a 4-cylinder.
It's 4-cylinder. Yeah, they're 7-inch pistons.
That's crazy.
You can't really believe it until you see one. My whole hand goes on the top of the piston. And so because of this lack of restrictions with a car like this, the cool thing is that a car like this Mercedes, it took like 20 years for faster cars to come out. This car is faster than almost everything that would come for another 20 years because they started to impose more and more displacement restrictions on racing. So to make the similar power, you had to get that out of technology somewhere. You had to some other way. The old no replacement for displacement thing is very true in this era, because if you don't have displacement, how are you going to get that equivalent power? So for the manufacturers to make a motor that had the equivalent power to a 17-liter motor, within a few years, Grand Prix was down to 4.5 liters and 3 liters. A lot of technology needed to make up for 13 missing liters of engine size. And a lot of that they had to make engines turn faster and spin faster and supercharging and things. But interestingly, so the same race, so this car goes to the Semmering in 2008, crushes it, wins outright. Mercedes is 1 and 2 with the 2 cars they send. And of course, back then the car is driven from the factory to this race in Austria. No transporters, so it had to both be road capable and capable of winning the race. So it wins. It sets a record in 08. It comes back in 09 with the same size engine, but with a redesigned motor with a heavier case on it. Smashes the previous record again. So that's 1909. So 1926, Rudolf Caracciola, the top Mercedes driver, goes to the same race with a supercharged K Rennwagen, does the course 1 minute slower than that 08 Mercedes. So, the best technology almost 20 years later was still a minute slower than that car in 1908. So again, that car was a 7 liters versus the 17-liter car.
Wow. Okay. So I understand more about the historic importance of this car for sure. Now the estimate's $7 to $9 million. Will be interesting to see what it does, because obviously, I think we've seen a little bit of the pre-war stuff go a little flat the last couple of years, but historic automobiles that rarely come up for sale.
I mean, the big horsepower early stuff is very, very strong from an auction standpoint. The little of it that's come up has been mostly set records in the last few years. The simplex cars, the Mercedes,
Gooding had early Mercedes last year. Gooding had a pre-war Mercedes race car.
$12 million race/road car. That one. And so no, this stuff is so rare in the whole hobby of collecting cars. The early high displacement race cars are the rarest thing. There's only, there's just a very few handful of cars like this, and most of them have just been sitting in museums forever. They're all mostly in museums, and so there really hasn't been anything like this that's come for auction in a very, very long time. A genuine factory Mercedes huge displacement racing car of their peak time period of their significance. I mean, there's one other very good 08 Mercedes that exists in Germany, and there's one other car, but these are incredibly rare. There's really just sort of like 2.5 or 3. I don't know the disposition of the other one. I haven't seen it. And most of the equivalent cars that exists, the 1907 Fiat or the 1907 Locomobile, those are all in museums. So this car is one of the few out of captivity. So it's, the most exciting early racing car to come to market in, it would have to go back more than sort of 20, 25 years at this point. You have to go back to like the Hera auction, I think, in the 80s.
Wow. Okay.
So this kind of stuff just is unbuyable. And this car is really, really, really good too. This car, we know where this car was at every moment in its life from new. And this car, because it's got its chassis plate and identification number, we have every record from Mercedes, everything this car ever did, ever driver retire that was on the thing. I mean, they keep meticulous records of these things, and we know every point up to Indianapolis, where it's been since like 1962. So, I mean, the provenance is just fantastic. So it is, truly one of the great things you could ever get to buy of this era. And, we can't forget just what an unbelievable thing this is to use. That one of the things that really drives the value on these cars is the fact that you can use these things. It's not a Grand Prix car from today. You can fire this car up and drive it on the street, which I've had fortune of doing quite a few miles in this car so far. And there's nothing like driving a car that's one of these 15-liter plus 4-cylinder cars are just the wildest things you'll ever drive. And to have a car that has all its power at the lowest RPM and this like instantaneous response, and that will go down the road at 75 miles per hour at 800 RPM or less, just absolutely effortless. And no matter what kind of high performance car you've driven or been in, you've never driven anything that has this sort of seat of the pants instant power like that supercars don't develop 750 foot-pounds of torque at 600 RPM. They just,
Right.
it's
Right.
not that. You just don't have that sensation with any other kind of car. And with the whirring chain drive and the steering of the thing, I mean, there's just like nothing like it. I mean, the experience of being in one of these cars is not duplicatable in any other time period or any other type of car. And few people on the whole planet have ever experienced being in one. And I represented as another early similar capacity racing car a couple of years ago, and I took a bunch of people for a drive in it. Really experienced people, and absolutely blown away by the thing. They just couldn't believe what it was like to be, how fast it was, and how visceral it was. And a friend of mine who races, big block Cobras and GT40s and all kinds of stuff, and has all sorts of cars. But I took him out, and he's like, that's the fastest thing I've ever been in for the first 300 feet. The sensation of it is completely different than anything else. And, you can't fly an airplane from 1908. You can't, there's not much like it of that time period you can experience. But if you're lucky enough, you can experience what it's like to be in one of these cars and how they drive. And it's hard to go back once you've experienced one. They're just unbelievable things.
Okay, if I see you in Moda and you need to take it for a spin and there's an empty seat, I'm going to jump in.
Oh, it's going to be well exercised down there. The other ones, I'm not a proponent of leaving stuff sitting like that. People really need to see and hear and experience what something like that's all about.
Well, it's funny because it's a car at a time, really. Like you said, like the performance numbers they wasn't surpassed for 20 decades later. And it's funny because if you're not a car person, I can relate it in an experience I had with film. I was studying film a long time ago, and I stumbled across the most famous Citizen Kane, one of the best, most incredible Orson Welles films of all time. And
Absolutely.
I fell in love with it.
Yeah.
But it's the same kind of thing. Stuff was done in that movie that wasn't done for years later. They used shadowing to tell a story, the distance of the couples, the camera angles, the whole storytelling was totally unique and new. And I remember, so if you're not a pre-war expert, like I'm not, and you see this car, you just don't get how important it is. And I remember I took a bunch of friends. I was like, all right, Fox Theater, downtown Atlanta, let's go see Citizen Kane. And we walk out and our friend was like, what was the big deal? That was kind of a boring movie. But they didn't have the context.
They didn't have the context. Yeah. Something like that where, so much of it is ingrained in stuff that came later that you don't have the context of how remarkable it was for its time period as well. And there's a little bit with this. And, I like about stuff like this is you have to kind of educate people a little bit. And easiest way to educate them is having the thing running and taking people out. And you immediately get it once that happens. And, it's one of those things, like even just in a most basic way, dealing with a lot of cars like this. And you think, okay, it's not an inexpensive car. It's not this, but you drive into anything with a GTO or a Testarossa or these cars that are, incredibly expensive. They won't even look at those cars when you come in with something like that, because the ruckus that thing makes and the just the spectacle of it is just so, like, people have never seen anything like it. The sound of it, it's a endless crowd pleaser. It's a shame this kind of stuff is so incredibly scarce because very few people ever get to see it in the flesh.
Right. Okay. That's awesome.
Except for at this auction, which we're like spoiled because we have another one. We also have the Atala.
Let's talk about that one because while I have pre-war expert on here, let's talk about that car. Tell us about it. It's a really cool looking thing, and its estimates $2 to $3 million again from the Speedway Museum.
And it's very much a contemporary of this car, particularly in the. This is a Grand Prix car. The Atala is a Grand Prix car, so it's built to the Grand Prix formula. So the engine's a little bit smaller. It's the same size bore, but it's a 15-liter motor, 4-cylinder, overhead valve, very similar design to the Mercedes. Quite a successful car, particularly before the Mercedes really got up to speed in that era. But it is a genuine, real Grand Prix car from 1907. It's the real deal. It's a 120 horsepower, and there are only two of them. And they're spectacular, and they're great driving cars too. You know, they're not as perfectly refined as the Mercedes. You know, they're a bit bigger scale to them and all, but it doesn't matter. I mean, they're fantastic, and they're punchy as can be. You know, just they're great cars. And yeah, it's the only. You know, there were two of them. One that lived at the Bewley Museum in England, and then this one, it's been in Indy, and that one's no longer in Bewley. That's here at my shop right now, and the other one is now out. So it's a great chance. And that car isn't as perfectly preserved in a way. It's had a little bit more done with it, or it had a little bit more of a life to it than the other one, but it's still original motor, original transmission, original carburetor, axles, frame. It's a really proper car. It was made into a road car early in its life, and it was actually Henry Seagrave's road car. It was the second car he ever owned, and had a touring car body on it. So the body on it's been rebuilt, hence the sort of lower estimate on it. But it's just absolutely sensational thing. And I'll say too, if you're interested in some of these big cars in action, it's worth going to YouTube and looking up the Goodwood SF Edge Trophy race, where they do a race at the revival of, or at members meeting, I can't remember, but it's easy to find, specifically of pre-World War I cars. And you'll see these cars in action, and they're absolutely unbelievable to watch these races. The way these cars get thrown around and how close these races are, and the speed of these things in action. It's a neat taste of what it's like. So we're spoiled. You know, you don't ever see cars like this at auction. We just happen to have two of them in this sale, and as well as the little 1911 Lauren Clement car, which is it's a totally different end of the displacement spectrum at only 900 cc, but it's a very important little race car, and very original. Other than a paint job, it is like as it was last raced. Original upholstery, original fabric fenders. But the interesting thing about this, if you're interested, you know, if you follow like modern Formula One type, this is the first car ever built that had active aerodynamics.
I was going to ask you about that, because it's such a funky looking thing. It's got a huge, literally, it's rectangular, you know, foil, rudder, whatever you want to call it, coming out of the back of it, and funky
it's a rudder. I mean, it's basically a rudder.
Yeah.
And it is. Well, notice first of all, it's basically the same era as these other two cars we talked about, but look how aerodynamic it is in general. The slope front, midship radiator, the long fabric fenders, and then it has a steerable rudder that's linked with the steering wheel. So as you turn the car, it actually goes the other way, and it basically was intended to prevent the rear end from sliding out. It created force to hold the rear end in around turn. I don't know how.
A 1 year only thing? Did they figure it?
This is really a one-off. Well, it was a one-off race car. Actually, I think it also was in the Semmering race as well. Got lots of publicity in the period. It was not a product. It wasn't a design of Lauren Clement necessarily. It was like commissioned by a customer who had these theories. And according to the period articles, it was, you know, he reported it to be effective, and a lot of those courses were dirt. So, you know, having that extra side force to keep it in line could have been helpful. But had the car here, we got it running, and it's a sweet little running and driving car. So it is a fully usable thing, and it's a wild little car. It's not particularly expensive for such an important little race car, but it's certainly a precursor to a lot of what's talked about today.
Yeah, so if you can't afford $2 to $3 million or $7 to $9 million, whatever it was, how about this one, 100 to 150? So
I know for a real, like, 100% original, very significant little race car, it's a bargain. Certainly, someone could give a lot of stuff you could do with that. You've got an open invitation to go to just about any event in the world with a car like that for a relatively, comparatively cheap estimate.
And that's an external radiator, is that right?
Yeah, it is. Yep, it's over the cowl. of the car. And it's got a little aerodynamic water tank on the top. It's beautifully made little thing, tiny engine, but a real sort of jewel of a thing, and just runs wonderfully too. Very easy to start.
Yeah. Well, now before I let you go, I am curious.
Yep.
You mentioned that this was at your shop getting not recommissioned, but kind of recommissioned,
Yep.
right? Up and running. Did
Yep.
many of these cars go your way first before they go to Miami?
Yeah, I had 4 of them here. I had the Mercedes, the '08 Mercedes, I had the '07 Atala. So got those 2 running. Got the Lauren Clement running. Got the Mercedes touring car going as well. So we had those. I had those 4 of them here.
Are they down in Florida now?
I think they're in Detroit at the moment. There's some more
gotcha.
filming and stuff to do there. So so I got to put, particularly Mercedes, got to put quite a few miles on it while I was here, and the Atala. So it was good. It's nice because you had a really good look at the cars too, so you can really know what you're dealing with. And then the Mercedes, all the inside of the frame rail, all that still had all the original paint on it, and all the stuff that you can, when you have time to really get involved with the car, you can find this really wonderful details and know exactly what you're dealing with and do all your research correctly.
That's awesome. Well, before I let you go, is there anything else you wanted to cover from the Miami sale? I'll cover a bunch of the other cars separately, but any other cars you just wanted to?
Well, we've also we've got a neat 1906 Zust coming over from Europe as well, a car that was a Targa Florio car in period, another cool early race car. So we're going to have like a amazing chance to see a bunch of really interesting early. That's another chain drive racing car, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, we've got the supercars and all that stuff, but we've got an amazingly interesting collection of early stuff there, and all of that stuff is going to be fired up and running, and it's a chance to see it and hear it and see it in action. So it's going to be fun down there. It's going to be a festive atmosphere. The other one worth mentioning too is the Bugatti coming out of the Indy Museum, which is a Type 35 TC, or often called B these days, a supercharged Grand Prix car. And nice thing about this car, it did have like a bit of an American restoration back in the 50s, but it's a very unmessed with because it's been sitting there since the 50s. And I looked this thing over carefully, and most of its body is all original. It's had some work in the cowl area, but the hood, the tail, so the under trays, which is really unusual on those cars, but original motor, transmission, axles, frame, it's got the original paint in the frames. It's got the original gas tank. It's Bugattis there's a lot of Grand Prix Bugattis around, and some of them are light on original parts, but I mean, this thing is really nice. I mean, it'll need it needs a little reviving at this point, but it's a very, very pure car. And great specification to it. So it could be easily overlooked, because it's a bit dated on the restoration, but it's a very, very good car under there. No, I'm excited about it. I think this is be the most fun group of stuff to come out in a long time. Of course with the the GT40 and that, I love that Corvette. I mean, that thing is just. That is a wild car. I mean, that is something else. I mean, it's a piece of American racing history and development. That is just, it's going to be this is a once in a generation sale here.
Yeah,
really,
it's going to be very, very exciting for sure. So,
and it's easy for stuff to get overlooked because there's so much great stuff.
I know. There's so much good stuff. It's like, oh, there's also a Ferrari F40 over there. Yeah, well, I want to see the other stuff.
Exactly.
That's crazy. Well, as always, I appreciate you being on the podcast. This was such a cool podcast, and you really dove into it so deeply. I'm going to break this out as its own podcast, and then we'll also have a Moda Miami of the other more average cars, I guess you might say. It's hard. The riches are very strong at Moda Miami.
Embarrassment of the riches here with But I always say with an auction, it's one thing to have the sales totals and all, but really the goal is to have the most interesting auction. And we certainly can't argue with this one. This is about the most interesting, diverse group of stuff to come along in a very, very long time, if ever.
RM does a great job at that, which makes it difficult as a car specialist, because you can't always get in a great, 280 SL Mercedes, because there's so many other crazy cool stuff coming in.
So. I think Arizona's a perfect example. That was about as diverse a group of cars as you can put in one sale. That's what people like. People like that.
Awesome, dude. Well, thanks, Evan. I appreciate you being on the Collector Car podcast.
No problem.